So Cadillac Frank Salemme grew up in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, which was a mixed demographic neighborhood. Back in the 1940s and 50s, it was Irish, Italian, Eastern European, Middle Eastern, Jewish, some black people. That became the more dominant demographic in the later decades, like after the 60s. But back when Frank was coming up, it was mixed. And he himself was of mixed heritage. He was half Irish, half Italian. So it wasn't like he was growing up in the North End or Eastie or over in Revere where it was like a dominating Italian population. But I think in his younger years, Frank was just kind of a tough street kid from Roxbury neighborhood of Boston. But later in life, we started to like take on that persona and really become it. And it was almost like an over the top portrayal of the persona of an LCN character. You know, the way he walked and talked and mannerisms. It was just like it was almost like a actor's portrayal of a not that he wasn't the real deal, but it was just. It was almost like he was playing a part, you know. And Steve Flemmi said that way back in the '60s that he was like copying Bayonne, and it was really forced and noticeable. So, but coming up, his first crew that he was a part of was the leader was an Irish guy. Whippy Bennett and his brothers are Irish, and even though he was Irish and independent, he was very close with Raymond Patriarca, as Wimpy Bennett I'm speaking about. So he was Wimpy's basic. Wimpy was basically Raymond's spy in Boston. He referred to Raymond as George, and he was real tight with him. Raymond liked Wimpy all the way up until the end when he found out that Wimpy was just all these guys like back in the day. It wasn't frowned upon to talk to police. They all interacted with law enforcement. They all paid cops off. Law enforcement officials in the 1950s and 60s were like just so corrupt because they didn't get paid much. The base salary was very low, so obviously somebody's gonna grease their palms. It wasn't like today where there's all these like safety nets to watch for corruption and make sure people aren't taking bribes, stuff like that. Everybody was taking bribes back then, and it was just commonplace for criminals to interact with cops and politicians and to pad their pockets. So the fact that Wimpy had police contacts wasn't odd, but then when people started finding out that the information wasn't just coming from the police to Wimpy. Wimpy was also giving the police information, and that was not okay. That was not acceptable. And so when Raymond found that out and other people out, and that's what Steve Flemmi and Frank Salemme ended up using for an excuse to get rid of Wimpy. But I think it was more the fact that they had just got sick of him nickeling and diming them, and they were feeling like they wanted to sow their oats and become like their own men, and take the crew over for themselves. So, but they would have learned. The whole point of me talking about this is that Frank would have learned from Wimpy how to deal with the LCN and the Italian Mafia, and to make the connections. He would have known Raymond. Raymond would have known who Frank was. For two guys that weren't even part of the original conflict, they sure made their mark in it in the 1960s. But the thing is, though, is they both went on the lam. I've talked about this. I've done videos in the past. They both went on the lam. When Flemmi came back, he was allowed to stay on the street. When Cadillac Frank Salemme went away, came back from being on the lam, he went away to prison. He went away to state prison, to Walpole Prison for I don't know what the exact years was. I think it was more than 15. I've read 15 years, but I think it was more like 17. He got out in 1987, but he was away for a long time. And the whole time that he was away, Steve Flemmi was out there on the streets operating. Um, I'm sure that Frank Salemme had his suspicions about his friend, his quote unquote friend Steve Flemmi. And I know that Baby Shanks Minoko, when he was hanging out with Cadillac Frank, when Frank was in New York on the lam from planting the bomb in John Fitzgerald's car, Joe Barbossa's lawyer. Baby Shanks was hanging out with him down in New York when they're on the lam, and Steve Flemmi came to visit them, and Baby Shanks told Frank, that guy's no good, stay away from him. So I know a lot of people thought that Steve Fleming was suspect from way back, and I'm sure Frank had his ideas and had his suspicions, especially when he got out and he saw the position that Steve Fleming was in, how he hooked up with Whitey, how they basically had clung on to Winter Hill as like hanger-ons, kind of like minor players in the group, and then all of a sudden they everybody else disappears and now they consolidate and take over like the second power. By the end of like the 1970s, Winter Hill was the second most powerful faction in the city of Boston behind the Italian Mafia. They had like the most bookies and the most resources, and they had John Morano and Joe McDonald and some of the top hitters in the city. So the fact that Steve Fleming was able to cling on to them as like a kind of a hanger on, and then him and Whitey basically maneuvered their way to the top and got rid of everybody else through their connections, obviously, with the FBI and John Connolly, and then the corrupt U.S. Attorney Jeremiah O'Sullivan, who kept them out of the indictment in 1979 so they didn't go away for the race fixing um, indictment that all the other Winter Hill guys went away for, and that what guys didn't go away went on the lam and were basically not out in the street operating, but those two guys were left off. And now everybody didn't like just see that a gigantic red flag and say that these guys are obviously up to something that they're left off of that. But either way, they didn't. So Frank's in the can the whole time while this is going on. He's obviously hearing all this stuff. Even though he's in the can, he knows what's going on in the street. He has to be hearing all this stuff, and it's got to be getting to him. That hearing how successful his friend Steve Fleming is. Steve Fleming chose to go in a different route. Um, Before they went away, the whole reason they were involved in that situation with John Fitzgerald and blowing up the car was because they were trying to do a favor for the mafia. Because John Fitzgerald was the attorney for Joe Barbosa, and Joe Barbosa was testifying against the mafia and perjuring all these guys and putting them away. All his personal vendettas, and John Fitzgerald was passing messages back and forth between Barbosa and his crew members that were still on the street. And Raymond Patriarca deemed that as being like way over the line for what a lawyer should be doing, what a citizen should be doing. So he ordered down hit, and he wanted it to do it in a very public way to blow up his car. So Steve Fleming kind of didn't want to do it, but he said he felt like he didn't have a choice, so he went along with it. But Frank Salemme was all about it. He wanted to prove to Raymond, and he was doing it with Larry Bayonne, who was like kind of like his hero from what I can tell. Like he was, if there was someone he was trying to emulate, it was Bayonne. Like Jerry Angulo he was the brains, he was the moneymaker. Bayonne was like the street guy. He was the muscle guy. He was if you were a street guy and you were like one of the tough guys out there, Bayonne, Lars, and he was the one that you were like striving to be and like looking up to. He was your hero. The Bayonnes and the J.R. Russos. Those were like what the street guys, the tough guys were looking up to. And Julo was like he was Zerner. Do the original deed. It's all Frank Salemme basically pushing the issue, want to do it. Steve Fleming feels he's just along for the ride because he has no choice, can't say no. And it's them and Larry Bayonne and his buddy Phil Wagenheim, Jewish guy from Revere who was like best friends with Larry Bayonne and was his henchman in a lot of things that happened in the 1960s. Connect the guy to LCN, but obviously because he's Jewish, couldn't be a made man. But I should do a video about him in the future. He's a mysterious guy who was around for a lot of stuff, and he was Bayonne's man. Bayonne had his own little crew of non-LCN members that included Phil Wagenheim and this guy Red Assad, who was a Syrian guy. So also he was tough as nails, and he had some bodies on him. And he was involved with taking out Tosh Bratos, his older brother that Tosh Bratos hated Bayonne for. But again, he was of Syrian descent, so he couldn't be a made man. But he was, an LCN associate, just like Wagenheim was. And they used these guys a lot, not just in Boston and Rhode Island, but in New York and all around the country. Like LCN always used non-Italian guys to do a lot of their dirty work, whether it was Irish or Jewish or Greek or some sort of other ethnic group. So the whole time Frank's in there, he's doing time, man. his body is physically locked in this building, but his mind's not. His mind's out there. And I feel like a lot of people kind of like clown on Frank Salemme or think he was kind of a joke, and the authorities certainly did. They didn't take him seriously until all this stuff was unfolding in the 90s. They didn't believe that he, coming out of prison, could have the kind of pull that he did, the kind of connections that he made, the fact that he cozied up to Junior Patriarca. That was just a power move. That was only because he knew. So the whole time he's in there, he's feeling people out. He's making connections. He's making friends. He's seeing people that. Uh, there's some people like J.R. Russo, Vinny Ferrara, um, certain people on that end of the spectrum that they don't take Frank Salemme serious. Uh, these guys aren't jailbirds. These aren't guys that are like in and out of prison all the time. So a lot of the people that Frank would become allies with, and when he made his power plays in the 1990s, when he got out of prison in the late 80s, a lot of these guys were people that were kind of what you would call jailbirds or convicts. People that do a lot of time. uh, They're lifelong career criminals. They are in there making new connections, forging new allies, making new plans, new schemes, new plots. So when they get out, they can, put it in motion. So Frank is hooking up with these type of people, and he's looking maybe for like, I don't mean to say this in a disrespectful way, but like he looked for somebody like Junior that he could see kind of as somebody he was able to manipulate or like weak in a certain way, but I'm not saying that Junior was like he's like a weak man or anything like that. But Frank saw him as somebody that he could manipulate, and J.R. Russo and Vinny Ferrara in that camp are not people that he's going to be able to manipulate. They don't see him as a real LCN guy. They're never going to accept him. So he's not going to waste his time with that. Frank's not. I don't think he's as stupid as people maybe had thought he was, or certainly that the authorities thought he was. So he's making connections with guys while he's in there, and he's not only making connections, but he's making connections with people like strategically, people that are placed out through the region. Because when he gets out, he knows that he's going to need to be able to count on people. That he can't be in all these different places at once. That he gets out, if he's going to try to force his will and try to like hold power and hold sway and control the rackets and cities and pull tribute from people, he's going to need men in these places. So that's what he started doing while he was in there. So, a couple names, people that he met while he was in there, is this guy, Gordon O'Brien, who's from Taunton, Mass. And this guy is just like probably he's been described as probably one of the scariest people that you could probably bump into in state prison. He's like 6 foot 2 or 3, over 300 pounds. I don't know if he was that big before, but like there's an old legend about him. So similar to Jerry, we met the Frenchman, the Prince of Federal Hill, who used to have sleepovers with his son while he was doing time in Rhode Island State Prison. And the guards and prison officials were so terrified of Jerry we met that they basically let him do whatever. So Gordon O'Brien was basically kind of from what I gather, was the Massachusetts equivalent of that, where the convicts, COs, prison officials, everybody was terrified of this guy, and he had a pet German Shepherd that he kept in his cell at Walpole. Uh, he was there for a crime that's usually not. I can't say the word on YouTube. He that usually people frown on in jail, but maybe he was wrongly convicted or accused, or maybe people just were afraid to confront him about it, or maybe it was a different culture back then. I'm not really sure how that works. Or worked back in the I think that was way back like in the 1970s or something like that. That was before he met Frank in there. But I mean, this guy was just an absolute legend. He allegedly was a user himself, was involved in that kind of world and that lifestyle, where he was selling to maintain his own, daily habituals, or he was actually making money of it. But he was involved in that kind of um, trade, but he basically was just feared throughout Taunton. As a younger guy, they would go around to like smaller towns around the area and terrorize bars and trash the places. Just like kind of like just young thuggery hoodlum stuff, like just robbing people for like their wallets and pocket, like pulling people's pockets, running their pockets and stuff. But this guy was like one of those, like I'm saying, he was like a convict, like a jailbird, and Cadillac Frank hooked up with him when he was in Walpole, and that was a connection that he made in Taunton. And when he got out, he was gonna tap Gordon O'Brien to run that city down there for him, and that's been a lucrative city for LCN, and it's also very strategically placed. It's right in between Boston and Providence. It's like in the halfway point. So like members from both cities could meet in Taunton on neutral ground and discuss things and kind of share the rackets. And it's kind of a more important city to LCN than you would think. And then they have, the Taunton Rainham track, which is right there. And LCN guy, I think for a majority of time, like their guy that they used to have in that area in Taunton, I think was the Saint, Anthony the Saint Laurent, who I read in the newspaper one time. They dubbed him Public Enema #1. Oh man, that's brutal. This poor guy. They got a picture of him and he's got like no teeth, and that's what they called them in the paper. They're brutal. The press. They are. I mean, it's fine. I laughed obviously when I saw it, but they're brutal. But so this guy, I'm gonna do. My friend David Fishwick sent me a bunch of information on him, tons of articles on him. So I think he was like their guy in that area in Taunton and stuff, and he did not get along with Bobby DeLuca, who was Frank was Cadillac Frank was tight with him. He was one of his guys, and uh DeLuca was saying that the Saint was an informer, and the Saint was saying, DeLuca's an informer. I'm telling you guys, he's an informer. And everybody thought that he was like whacked out on drugs, that he was crazy and out of his mind, and nobody believed him. And then it ended up coming out later that DeLuca was in fact, and Saint was trying to get permission to whack DeLuca because he was saying that this guy's no good. He's an informant. I'm telling you, and nobody believed the Saint because they thought he was whacked out. But uh, you know, coming out of the can, Frank Salemme knew that that was going to be important. He was going to need to control that city. If he was going to try to have his grasp from all the way from Boston down to Province, like when you're waging war, there's like you need strategic, like there's like strategic key points. They're like if he wants to take over New England, he's going to have control of Taunton to have influence over Providence, which is not his area. He really doesn't have any power in Providence whatsoever. He's a Boston guy. Any people that he's met in Providence is people that he's met in jail through associations, through contacts. So it's important that he's got like these southern cities in Massachusetts under his control. And he's got loyal people that he can trust in there to hold the fort for him. So Gordon O'Brien was his man in Taunton. And then on the south coast of Massachusetts, talking about Fall River and New Beige, little Portugal down there on the south coast of Massachusetts. He met this guy while he was also in Walpole, a man named Timothy Mello, aka Timmy the Bat. And if you want to know why the papers dubbed him Timmy the Bat, well, I'm sure you can use your imagination. His main negotiating tool was a baseball bat, so they called him Timmy the Bat. But this guy, just like Gordon O'Brien, is like 6 feet tall, 250 pounds. He is a big, large Portuguese man. And just like Gordon O'Brien, Timothy Mello comes from like a street thuggery background where he was also using, involved in that lifestyle, selling. sticking people up, robbing people. I'm not gonna go into too much detail because I'm actually putting together uh, my own video. His like Timothy Mello's getting his own video because this guy is he's quite a character. So, but he was from basically the same school of thought as Gordon O'Brien. Big bully type guy. He's taking it by force. He's not a finesse guy. He's a brute. He's taking things by force. He's got a nasty reputation back in the 70s and 80s in Fall River and New Beige, for being involved in that lifestyle and just he basically he just had a nasty reputation. Like people basically said he didn't have any scruples. Like he was accused of doing basically whatever to get what he needed, threatening people's families, shooting people's houses up, the whole nine. As he evolved in his criminal enterprises, he became a little bit more refined, and he actually, the video I will do in the future, in the near future, actually, he expands his portfolio quite extensively in the future. But for right now, in the 70s and 80s, while Cadillac Frank is in Walpole and he's building up his forces and he's gathering his allies, Timothy Mello is just like a street thug out there, but Frank sees potential in him. And he's already out there, Timothy Mello, even at this time back then. He went to Walpole originally on an 8 to 20-year sentence, and he got out in 3 years. So, and the lawyer that got him out of this ended up becoming disbanded for like all types of different corruption things. So even back then, Timothy Mello had connections and he was working magic to get things done. So Frank Salemme's got Gordon O'Brien in the important strategic city of Taunton, Mass. It's halfway between Providence and Boston. Now, on the South Coast, where a lot of people think maybe it's not that many, that's a thing too, is like people in Fall River and New Bedford really didn't think that there was of course, there's rackets in those cities. I mean, those cities they're rough cities, but they're predominantly Portuguese. There's really not much of an Italian population there, and they kind of thought like a lot of stuff was localized, and that people in that city, like the players there, didn't have connections outside, and they weren't connected to this like kind of bigger, wider syndicate and criminal conspiracy, if you will. You know what I mean? But City and Timothy Mello especially is very much connected and intertwined with this stuff. And so, like I said, it began in the 70s and 80s with Cadillac Frank cultivating these contacts in Walpole Prison. I feel like a lot of people don't really take Cadillac Frank like as serious as some other, mobsters or organized crime figures. He saw himself as like a general, and when he came out of prison, he had a plan. Certain circumstances like accelerated that plan, i.e., the Medford induction ceremony, where the whole top tier of organized crime in Massachusetts and New England and Providence disappeared and left a huge void. And then they moved on him and they drew first blood and they gave him the reason. They took out Grasso, and not only did they get him hell bent on revenge to the people that like tried to take him out in the IHOP parking lot, but there was such a gigantic power vacuum that he had no other choice but to make the move, and he was already all set up because this is what I'm saying. The whole point of the video is he was plotting this the whole time he was in prison in the 70s and 80s. He felt like there was something owed to him, whether it was delusions of grandeur, or just like fantasizing and wanting to be something in his head, and he manifested itself into reality. And all these things happened. He found himself in the position to become the boss, and he went for it. He took it, and then he waged war on his enemies and sought revenge. And he had these guys set up. He had these brutes like Gordon O'Brien and Timothy Mello down southern New Hampshire to hold the southern border for him. He made friends with this lunatic Kevin Hannaran, who was one of his like main um, henchmen during the war in the 90s. I talked about guys in the actual video that I made about the 1990s mob war about Richie Devlin and Richie Gillis, and he inherited Mark Rossetti as one of his top muscle guys uh, before he went away in 2012 and got outed as working with the FBI. He was listed as a capo, and he was a made man. And I don't really think he was responsible for like bodies like they say he is on like Project Marino and stuff like that. I just think a lot of people don't like him, and there's still like a lot of bad blood, and people have their opinions and stuff. But I know that some of the unsolved murders I was talking about, like the guys who are like 3 months in a row, like Chinky Farini, Bobby D, and I don't know, I forget what the other guy was, but in a 3 month period, like September, October, November, three guys found like beaten and hogtied and stuff in their shinks, and they were all had like Cadillacs. Well, I think almost every gangster in Boston in the 1980s and 90s drove a Cadillac or a Lincoln. But I don't. Mark Rossetti wasn't responsible for these. I think Hanrahan's and O'Brien was charged with one of those. O'Brien was charged with Chinky Farini's, but he was eventually they didn't go through. They dropped the charges and he was acquitted on it. They couldn't find evidence to convict him. But after Hanrahan, Kevin Hanrahan was ended up murdered in '92 because the guy was a maniac. He was just out there on the streets, robbing everybody, uh, whacking everybody, and he ended up getting whacked himself in Providence in the street, like right on the middle of the street in 1992. But after they found DNA evidence linking him to it, saying that he was in fact the murderer, and I think he was uh, responsible for a lot of these bodies that were falling, that were enemies of Cadillac Frank. So, the point of my video is um, research I've been doing for other stuff. I've been finding different people and names. I've been making connections, stuff like that, and I realized that the whole time that Frank was in prison, of course, you make friends in prison. You meet people. You make acquaintances. You cross paths with people. You make connections. It's like criminal college where you're plotting and scheming and building connections when you're out on the street. But Frank was like empire building when he was in there. He was strategically like I don't think it's just by coincidence that he became tight with Timothy Mello and became tight with Gordon O'Brien and Kevin Hanrahan. He's going, oh, you're from there, oh, you're from here. And he's thinking, I don't have a guy here, I don't have a guy there. You know what I mean? I don't think Frank was stupid. I think he knew what he was doing. Um, he really is the main factor. I mean, they, like I said, they drew first blood. They attacked him first in the Saugus parking lot. But I mean, he was the main accelerator of violence in the 1990s. Like he was the reason that it went to the level that it went to. He was hell bent on getting the guys that got him and just wiping out his enemies and anybody that was opposing him. I think he got a little like almost like a tyrant, a little power hungry when he actually got the top spot. Once he actually got the spot and he was the boss, like I'm saying with my fingers, quote unquote boss, because it was like boss of kind of what at that point. It was the family was in shambles. Like I said, the whole top tier went away. Frank was a guy that wouldn't have been made in a million years if those guys didn't go away in the induction ceremonies. Like guys like Vinny Ferrara and J.R. Russo would have never let Frank Salemme be made. Um, so he took advantage of that, and when he became boss, I think he just went a little bit power crazy with it, a la Stalin, Hitler, and those guys. That's a kind of a crazy comparison. I'm not comparing Cadillac Frank to those guys. I'm just saying he went a little bit over the top when he got the reins, and he was hell bent on revenge and getting everybody that came after him. So that was a pretty good informative video, I think. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I was looking forward to talking about this stuff, and I'm very much looking forward to bringing you guys the full length, like in-depth Timothy Mello, and I have a feeling a lot of you guys, obviously a lot of you guys have heard of him, but I think a lot of you guys might not have too, and a lot of people are gonna see the video, hopefully, will have not have heard of him and a lot of stuff, and it'll be new and interesting information. So that might be my next one. It'll definitely be coming up soon in the next few. So if you guys like this video, hit the like button, subscribe if you are not subscribed already. Make good choices, make good decisions, Take good care of yourselves, your family, your loved ones, friends, other fellow human beings. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon. God bless everyone.